Welcome, listeners, to Streams of Resistance, a special series by the Wayward Wanderer, where we find out more about the far right and what people are doing about it, from the folks who are in the thick of it. In Part 4, we will be finding out more about eco-fascism, what it is, the related concept of fossil fuel fascism that has been making the rounds in the green movement lately, how these are related to climate change, and what we can do about them. Could you elaborate a bit more on your history with the environmental movement?
Well, I've been an environmental activist for well over a quarter century. Really got involved in the radical environmental movement and the IWW at the same time by first reading Judy Berry's book and then meeting her in 1995 and getting involved in the Headwaters campaigns of Northwestern California. But what really resonated with me was Judy's really deep understanding of intersectionality. Before that was a common use for the term, and just transition before that was a common use of the term. Green unionism, really, in which she was trying to do more than, and her comrades were trying to do more than just prevent the destruction of Northwestern California's old-growth redwood forest, but also to make sure that the timber workers were not adversely affected, even to the point of saying that it should be run by the workers themselves. That really resonated with me, and that really helped shape my political perspective. And, you know, it really was a direction I was sort of trying to find, but I found. And it really was, I think, basically what shapes my worldview today, or at least a big part of it.
What, in your own words, is eco-fascism?
Well, first of all, I am definitely not an eco-fascist. Let's make that quite clear. I'm opposite that end of the spectrum, or those various spectrums. Eco-fascist, well, first of all, let me kind of preface this by saying the ecology movement and or the green movement is not a monolithic phenomena. It has all kinds of different tendencies that sort of fall under a very loose and ephemeral umbrella with the color green, I guess. But eco-fascism is the most extreme sort of a white supremacist lifeboat ethics form of ecology in which it's elite, usually white dudes, straight white dudes at that, trying to preserve certain communities or ecosystems for their own use, and everybody else is basically screwed. And it definitely has a sort of misanthropic and Malthusian aspect to it. It would take far too long to go into some of the history of this, but I can summarize a few key points. Now, the Sierra Club, certainly not true today. The Sierra Club is a very progressive, multicultural, intersectional organization, but it was founded by rich white guys, particularly John Muir, and one of the motivating factors was creating these set-asides of, wilderness areas which were particularly gaudy and important, such as Yosemite National Park or Yellowstone National Park, and evicting indigenous people from those lands. And the indigenous people had done a fairly decent job, in fact, really good job of living in harmony with those lands and being the stewards of them. But this was not something that these wealthy, conservative white folks respected. They had a very colonialist mindset, and they looked down upon indigenous people as, quote, savages, unquote, which of course is not true, but that was a common worldview. And so, unfortunately, even from the get-go, vaunted organizations like the Sierra Club had a hint of eco-fascism within it. But fast forward to the 1920s and 1930s, when the classical fascist movement, with Hitler, Mussolini, and others, Franco in Spain and so forth, even within those movements, there were some elements of green thinking, but certainly in the service of fascism, not in the service of living in harmony with the earth, or having everybody have a healthy environment in which would enrich their lives and lead to their liberation. Later on, after the post-World War II era, there were ecological thinkers such as Garrett Hardin, who wrote the classic treatise, The Tragedy of the Commons, which unfortunately, a lot of people in the environmental movement took as a very important foundation of their doctrine, but really had very white supremacist hinges to it. It basically advocated a sort of lifeboat ethics in which wealthy elite protected themselves from the dirty, destructive masses, as opposed to the spaceship Earth theory, in which we're all interconnected and we're all stewards of this one planet, which we depend upon for survival, and an injury to one is an injury to all, not just in the human sense, but in the deepest ecological sense. And I'll even say that, while Earth First is certainly not like this anymore, Earth First is a very militant, green anarchist, radical revolutionary movement these days. The founders of Earth First, with the exception of maybe Mike Rozelle, had some actual fairly far-right or conservative roots. Dave Foreman had been a member of Young Americans for Freedom, although he claims he was opposed to William F. Buckley's wing of it, and he claims to come out of the libertarian wing. But a lot of his and a lot of the other founders of Earth First's inspirations were the deep ecology movement. And the deep ecology movement had some very questionable and dubious connections to Malthusian thinking and misanthropic thinking, but also some maybe not intentional, maybe intentional. And initially I used to think it was not intentional, but I begin to wonder now, because maybe it might have been intentional, connections to some rather unfortunate roots, such as Hardin and also Malthus, from which we get Malthusianism. And I'll say about Malthus, Malthus was a contemporary of William Godwin, and Malthus's treatise on population was written in response to Godwin's coming out as an anarchist. Godwin was the partner of Mary Wollstonecraft, who was a feminist, and their daughter was Mary Shelley, who wrote the original play which became Frankenstein. Malthus was not writing an ecological treatise when he wrote on population. He was writing a defense of reactionary class privilege, and this was the excuse he used to defend it. Now, there have since been many studies done that debunk Malthus and argue that his treatise on population is garbage. And similarly, with Garrett Hardin, there have been many writings done that says that The Tragedy of the Commons is very bad scholarship, because what Hardin was describing wasn't even actually a traditional commons, but in fact was what happens after the enclosures destroy the commons. And the economist Eleanor Ostrom has written several studies that debunk what Hardin has to say. There are others, but those are some of the basic highlights. And I want to just give my disclaimer here that I'm not the most foremost scholar on this, so there's people who could probably give you much more detailed and much more accurate answer than I gave, but those are some of the basic points.
What are some of the core ideas in Malthus's work and in Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons, and why are those so significant for understanding eco-fascism?
Well, Malthus, his argument basically was, as food expands arithmetically, as in 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, population expands geometrically, 2, 4, 8, 16, so on and so forth. That argument has since been debunked for several reasons, but basically his essential argument is that no matter what we do, the carrying capacity, that the population will expand until it just exceeds the carrying capacity, and that the starvation and suffering of poor people is nature's way of thinning the herd, so to speak. And I don't know if he actually argued that this was applicable to people and animals. He might have, but certainly some ecologists have said that it applies to all species. But why that's significant or why eco-fascists find affinity with that is it's an excuse to justify the suffering of the poor and downtrodden, those who are exploited by capitalism, colonialism, racism, imperialism, and so forth. And so extreme versions of Malthusianism are tenets that eco-fascists definitely take up. Even Dave Foreman was known to have said that, AIDS is a well, actually, I mean, it was Chris Maines who said this. He was a fellow Earth Firster. And these Earth Firsters, by the way, were quickly discredited within the Earth First movement by much more progressive Earth Firsters, but this was in the early days before Judy Berry got involved. Dave Foreman argued that providing food to starving Ethiopians and other Africans was actually doing them a disservice, because he said the most humane thing would be to let nature take its course and let them starve, which is a horrific way of looking at the problem. And Chris Maines, writing under the pseudonym Miss Anthropy, and he later argued it was a joke, but really there's no proof that that was the case. This was back in the 80s when AIDS was a new phenomenon, was arguing this was nature's way of thinning the herd, which is not only horribly homophobic, but also completely inaccurate. But these ideas persist among the eco-fascist movement, and they're used to justify setting up, like a Fortress Europe or a Fortress America, jingoistic anti-immigrant hysteria, or just, setting up hierarchical systems in which the poor and the suffering are left to die. The Garrett Hardin, the tragedy of the commons, the basic theory was this, is if the commons, that there is a commons, and if it's unregulated, that humans will just abuse it and selfishly exploit it to its maximum, and therefore the solution to the problem is private property and or enclosures, which is actually the opposite. In fact, it was the enclosures that were causing the problems, not the lack of enclosure. But this is what Hardin argued, and Hardin became a white supremacist, or he was a white supremacist. And this has, of course, been disproven many times. I mean, Peter Kropotkin largely, argued convincingly the opposite was true when he wrote Mutual Aid. But several studies since then by Stephen Jay Gould and Eleanor Ostrom and others have definitely shown that that's not the case. And of course, this is further used to justify elitism, hierarchy, and exclusion of people who are migrants. And the migration is often caused these days by climate crisis.
How has the Green Movement responded to both these arguments and the sort of existence, you could say, of eco-fascist tendencies?
Well, that's a great question, and I'm going to have to give you a complex answer. The short nutshell version is that it has not been easy for at least the white part of the ecological movement to come to terms with the fact that it has a lot of roots in white supremacy, but I'm kind of sort of bleeding into the whole long rambling answer here, so I'll just go with it. Just as it's been hard for a lot of the white folks in white nations founded on white supremacy, like the good old US of A, colonialism and exclusion of people of color, it's taken a long, it's an ongoing process that's still happening now, even among the radical left, to come to terms with the fact that there are very deep roots of colonialism, patriarchy, racism, and fascism that unfortunately our civilization has been based upon. That's not to say that everyone should live their lives in shame. They just have to recognize that this is a long and painful process, but going through the process is important. Otherwise, we're never going to find the liberation or the survival from catastrophe that we seek. But specifically within the environmental movement, Earth First struggled with it very early on. Judy Berry wasn't the only person to argue against it, and nor was she the first. There was a lot of raucous debate within Earth First, which really didn't have a formal structure, and even most Earth Firsters would say we're a movement, not an organization, except usually that means that the loudest voices persist. So people like Dave Foreman and Ed Abbey, who Earth First was sort of inspired by in his book, The Monkey Wrench Gang, who had some rather right-wing views about immigration and certainly took inspiration from Hardin and Malthus, even if they were unconsciously repeating fascist tendencies. And I want to suggest that they weren't hardened fascists. I mean, I think they were more ignorant than deliberately so, because Dave Foreman also took inspiration from the IWW, even before Judy Berry joined, although I don't think he really ever got it, because he took a lot of the cultural elements of the IWW, but not really the class analysis of the IWW, and infused that into Earth First culture. And, could even argue that that's still a form of fascism, because fascists often wrap themselves in a sort of socialist garb, but they really don't have any honest belief in socialism, libertarian, authoritarian, or otherwise. It's a state socialism, or a fascist socialism, if there is such a thing, which is not really socialism. But there was a lot of debate within Earth First, and in the first decade of Earth First existence, this was a very raucous debate. There was a lot of argument in the pages of the Earth First Journal about immigration, about people of color, about things that Chris Mayne said as misanthropy. But I think it did take Judy Berry bringing the class struggle aspect to Earth First to really kind of make it become something that they couldn't get away from. And also the fact that a lot of the other parts of the left were paying attention to it, such as Murray Bookchin and others, calling out Earth First for these really horrible takes on what ecology was about. And not that Earth First biocentrism or deep ecology is inherently fascist, it's just that it was connected to a lot of these eco-fascist tendencies. Earth First in the last several decades, of course, has now become quite the opposite of that. Earth First now is committed anti-fascist and is one of the first organizations to speak up against it, and also speak out against ableism and all the things that were some of the cringy elements of the original old guard of Earth First. Similarly, there has been a lot of soul searching within organizations such as the Sierra Club. The Sierra Club issued a statement where they owned up to the fact that John Muir had some white supremacist tendencies, and that the Sierra Club, one of the early motivations was the idea of evicting indigenous people from wilderness areas, or what we call wilderness areas, and that this was wrong. Another thing that Sierra Club has recently owned up to is the fact that, the city of Berkeley is famous for coming up with the first zoning laws, and the Sierra Club, a Sierra Club member who later founded the Mason McDuffie real estate company, if I have this history right, was a Sierra Club member, but one of his motivations was keeping people of color out of white neighborhoods, or making exclusively all white neighborhoods. Obviously, that's not what zoning laws are used for now. Well, not entirely, but certainly not like that. But this has been a long process that's been affecting a lot of the environmental movement. And I think one hopeful sign is we're seeing a lot of these environmental organizations become much more diverse, taking on, or actually, actively seeking BIPOC leadership. The Sierra Club, for example, is one example of that. Greenpeace as well. Others have been trying to look at this. Although some organizations are still stuck in this old guard mentality. For example, Environmental Defense Fund and the World Wildlife Federation still make deals with corporations in which they do land swaps. The corporations are extractive capitalist corporations which extract fossil fuels from lands that have been swapped, and then other lands that the corporations had hoped to extract, they get traded to these environmental organizations. Environmental organizations work with these governments in places like Indonesia and other global south countries that don't have the best governing structures, and they wind up evicting indigenous people. And that's certainly, if not an open form of eco-fascism, certainly one that is adjacent to it. And the other thing is, there's always been, unfortunately, a tendency for eco-fascists to want to try and engage in entryism and take over these organizations. There were several attempts in the past 3 or 4 decades by anti-immigrant forces to take over the leadership of the Sierra Club and enact anti-immigration measures. In fact, Dave Foreman led one of these, or was part of one of these in the 90s, and he was beaten back because the membership of the Sierra Club didn't want to associate with that. But it's been a long struggle, and the struggle continues. There's a lot of elements that still need to be addressed. The whole NGO structure has a sort of top-down feel to it that has its roots in basically a culture that's founded on white supremacy and hierarchy, and it tends to favor privileged white educated folks as opposed to people of color and working class people. And I'm not going to be one who argues that all NGOs are alike. I find that to be a rather lacking in nuance argument, but certainly the big, more corporate-leaning NGOs do have this tendency.
To change gears a bit, is there a similar, in some ways, kind of movement centered around preserving fossil fuels in a fossil fuel economy? And how influential would this, as it's been described in some places, fossil fuel fascism be?
Well, I would argue that well, we talk about the rise of fascism now. Most of that is sort of essentially fossil fuel fascism by default. In other words, one of the core elements of this far-right revanchism is an attempt to hold on to fossil fuel energy systems as the dominant energy source for many, many reasons. I mean, it certainly enables petrostate capitalists with fascist tendencies like Vladimir Putin, but it also enables corporations and very masculine extractivist thinking. In fact, the scholar Kara Daggett has called it petromasculinity. And what I've noticed in particular is in places that have, not exclusively so, but generally so, where you see a lot of the very far right dominance, like for example, what in the United States of America are ironically called red states, because the Republican Party for the last 2 or 3 decades has used the color red, whereas the Democrats have used the color blue, which is sort of counterintuitive considering that the socialist and communist movement have traditionally adopted red as their color. And the deepest of the red states are usually, not always, but generally speaking, states with very heavily dependent upon fossil fuel and or mineral extractive economies. Think the North and South Dakota, Oklahoma, Idaho. Not always the case, but definitely there's a connection there. And so, one of the big things about Trump was the whole thing about the coal miners in West Virginia. In a span of 2 decades, West Virginia shifted from being a reliably quote unquote blue state, in other words, Democratic, to becoming a very deep red state because of the dependency on coal and the busting of the unions for that matter. But there's definitely a strong connection. Now, how that possibly meshes with eco-fascism is that, movements are tricky things, and even fascism, it never fits comfortably into an ideological box. I mean, a milder example might be the Republican coalition, that dates back to even predates, but really kind of hit its stride in the Ronald Reagan years. You had far-right evangelical Christians, you had paleo-conservatives, and you also had so-called right libertarians, or ANCAPs in the same party, and obviously they had different opinions on certain issues. For example, evangelical Christians and right libertarians have different opinions on, I guess, weed smoking, for example. They still managed to comfortably find a common umbrella under the Republican Party because they believed they had a common enemy. So we might see, and in some cases we already see, eco-fascists who genuinely are not very fond of any kind of extractivism. They have a sort of they're not the same as primitivists per se, but they share some, and I would say that most primitivists, even though I disagree with them on the issue of technology, are not fascists. There are some that are, and then there are some who unconsciously have an overlap. they might be anti-oil extraction, but they would happily make common cause with fossil fuel fascism in the sense that they see, they'll certainly treat immigration or LGBTI or others as enemies. And for that matter, I wouldn't put it past the fossil fuel capitalists to divide and conquer and rely on eco-fascism in order to keep people divided in such a way that the power remains in their hands. So we might see both fossil fuel fascists and eco-fascists making common cause to oppose just transition or shutting down extractivism or managed decline of fossil fuel capitalism or immigration for that matter, or attacks on climate refugees. So there's always room for that to happen, even if it doesn't seem logical that it would.
What do you think is most important for people outside of the green movement to understand about both eco-fascism and fossil fuel fascism?
Well, I think it's important to understand that fascism is a very dangerous thing, and it needs to be opposed. I would say, first of all, it's important to remember that the ecological movement is not entirely or mostly or even a large plurality eco-fascist. I'd say it's a very small fraction of the ecological movement. However, that doesn't change the fact that the ecological movement, unfortunately, has a lot of unfortunate roots that, again, it gets back to the idea that we're really coming to terms with the fact that a lot of Western civilization has roots that, in their most extreme, are fascist. And these are things that we have to evolve past and change and root out. And as we do that, I make the argument that what we're seeing is not so much the rise of a fascist movement, it's a reaction from already existing fascist elements that have taken off the gloves and are becoming more extreme because they're losing the capability to use a soft touch because their lies no longer work and more people are opposing it. That doesn't mean it's less dangerous than it used to be. If anything, it's much more dangerous. It's very similar to how dangerous absolutist monarchs became at the end of the feudal era. And we have to oppose it with all of our efforts and to root it out. That said, it has a common root in the idea of extractivism and the idea that the earth is a resource to be exploited. Even eco-fascists sort of have that view. They just think that there are certain places that should be preserved for what they consider to be the chosen people or their master race fantasy, and that everybody else can suffer. Whereas I think a true ecological perspective is that an injury to one is an injury at all. That applies to all species as opposed, in addition to all humans.
What do you expect to see from eco-fascists and fossil fuel fascists in the coming year?
Well, I don't want to. First of all, I'm going to preface this by saying that take this with a grain of salt because my crystal ball is just as cloudy as everybody else's, and I don't necessarily know everything. I think, first of all, one thing that, and some of your listeners might find this controversial, but you know where I stand on this issue. I think one of the big things that we're coming to terms with is just how much of the fascism is connected to Putin and his revanchist efforts in the war in Ukraine. So I think there's been a lot of what's happening is going to hinge upon what happens in Ukraine and what happens with this ongoing conflict. And I want to preface this by saying I am certainly not an ally of NATO. I do not support Western imperialism, but I think this idea that Russia is somehow this principled countervailing force to Yankee imperialism and not its own brand of imperialism and a very fascist brand of imperialism is a dangerous myth. And if the left doesn't realize this, it's going to enable further fascism, because if you look at every global fascist movement in the world, outside of the very tiny and largely exaggerated fascist presence in Ukraine, which is much, much smaller than a lot of the campus left likes to say it is, virtually every other fascist movement in the world has some alliance or some affinity to what Putin is doing or his worldview, and there are connections there. So I think we're going to see a lot of those movements continuing to double down on their rhetoric and double down on their revanchist tendencies. Hopefully, the resistance by the Ukrainians will beat some of that back. As far as fossil fuel capitalism, or just extractivism and mineral extractivism, definitely I think the classic socialist and or anarchist argument that as capitalism gets more desperate to protect its privilege and its power, it will rely on fascist elements to put down growing resistance. Now, there's a lot of debate within the left over how strong the workers' movement is. I'm of the opinion that just because it doesn't follow a Leninist playbook does not mean that it's weak. It's definitely disorganized, but I think it might be stronger than people think. And so that is something that we'll have to come to terms with. And as far as eco-fascism goes, it's, I have to say, and this is where, there are people who are better experts than me. I don't particularly keep tabs on specific eco-fascist movements, unfortunately. It's one thing I don't have time to do because I do so much else that's sort of related to green unionism. But I definitely think as the climate crisis worsens, as these conflicts worsen, and as, if the left gets more organized even, there are going to be a lot of pushback and reaction from eco-fascists, particularly targeting migrants, climate refugees and so forth, and pushing for things like Fortress Europe and Fortress USA. If the U.S. economy unravels further, it will certainly grow. But that doesn't mean that all is doom and gloom. It means that we have to be vigilant and we have to get organized.
Alrighty. Well, do you have anything that you would like to plug or promote?
Oh, that's very generous of you. Well, of course, I will promote the IWW Environmental Union Caucus, and our website's easy to remember, ecology.iww.org. I want to give a shout out to the website It's Going Down. I don't always agree with everything that's written there. Some articles I have massive disagreements with, but I would say they are an excellent resource keeping tabs on fascism and fights against it. On the matter of fossil fuel capitalism, and its relation to fascism, there are so many good resources on it. I definitely think, organizations like Climate Justice Alliance, Oil Change International, DeSmog, there's hundreds of others, and I don't have time to go into all of it. But just make sure that, joining the fight against fossil fuel capitalism is one way to fight against fascism. And, check out your local anti-fascist organizations. They may not, they're not organizations you can join per se, but they're websites everywhere, Twitter sites everywhere that keep tabs on this. These are not things I'm working on. I just want to give a shout out and lift up these things. And, I want to lift up in particular movements of color that don't, and the global South that often get overlooked by us white radicals. Because, I've learned a lot from them. We need to learn from them. They are people of color, really, they live this every day, and they experience fascism on a much greater scale than the white left does, or white working class people do. Not to say that we don't, we do, but it's important to listen to those voices and hear what they have to say, because we can learn a lot from them and learn how to undo our own hangups that prevent us from being good comrades in the struggle. I don't want to use the term ally because it's loaded. It's important to listen to them. They have something to say and they have experience, and we really could be stronger because of it. I hope that's helpful.
And where can people find the IWW Environmental Unionism Caucus online?
The website, ecology.iww.org.
Alrighty. Well, thank you again, Steve. It's been great having you on. And
Oh, it's a pleasure and it's an honor. Thank you so much.
alrighty. And this is Ryan Smith at the Wayward Wanderer, now signing off.
Something to say, and they have experience, and we really could be stronger because of it. I hope that's helpful.
And where can people find the IWW Environmental Unionism Caucus online?
The website ecology.iww.org.
Alrighty. Well, thank you again, Steve. It's been great having you on. And
Oh, it's a pleasure and it's an honor. Thank you so much.
alrighty. And this is Ryan Smith at the Wayward Wanderer, now signing off. If you enjoyed this podcast and want to help support more work like this, then please head on over to patreon.com/waywardwanderer. $5 a month gets you early access to podcast episodes, ad-free listening, monthly patrons-only live stream sessions with your host and author of The Way of Fire and Ice, Ryan Smith, and more. Please head on over to patreon.com/waywardwanderer. Thanks for listening.